Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Stallman, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. I appreciate everyone's time today. We're covering a topic that we've covered before, but it's a big topic and it's required a number of iterations and a lot of input from a variety of folks. And so appreciate you taking some time and learning today with me on this topic of what we're calling the Pracademic Guides to Strategy Deployment, Part 3. I'm going to keep the phones unmuted so as to encourage some dialogue and questions as we go through the different topics today. And if I get some background noise, I will mute the lines. Otherwise, we'll keep them open and people can feel free to ask questions and provide some commentary. Feel free to use the chat function on the webinar page, and you can put some questions there, some comments there, if that works better for you. This webinar is being recorded and will be provided for everyone to listen to later, and you can forward to other folks. This is a useful slide for me to introduce some topics to people, and the quote at the top comes from George Box, who's a statistician, and when he talked about all models are wrong, but some models are useful, he was talking about mathematical models, but I think this also serves as well as far as frameworks and models to think about. In some world, the models that we use may not work, but we think about these different mental models. And I like to think about this view, which I also borrowed from Derek Cabrera in his book Systems Thinking Made Simple, a book that I really like. Understanding that we don't really interact directly with the world when we're interacting with other folks and taking in information. What our mental models that we have are approximations of the way the world works. And as we have information and have experiences, it will affect and change our mental models. And I use this as an introduction to talk a little bit about some mental models or some frameworks to think about the topic today of strategy deployment. So one of the frameworks that we've been using is to think about what are the roles of different people in the organization using categories of leaders, managers, and frontline as it relates to serving the needs of the customers now, customers in the future. And we think about three key subsystems. One is the strategic subsystem, which does include both strategy development and strategy deployment. Another key system is the managing for daily improvement system, which is focused on what some people would call operations or tackling and managing the problems that are keeping us from providing value to the customers today. And the third subsystem, just put it in a band between the middle, is think about this as standard work and how those work together. And this comes from a recent white paper. So as we were writing this white paper on Pracademic's Guide to Strategy Deployment, a number of other subtopics popped up that then caused us to say, well, we should write about that. And one of those topics was side-by-side management. So if you want to learn more about this view and this model, you can go to that bit.ly link in the lower left-hand corner. So primarily the topic today is around what I've circled here is strategy deployment, although you will see connections to some of the other topics. So we're going to get into it, and I've listed what I think are 10 mental models for discussion, and I would like to invite people to weigh in on these topics. I was trying to put this into something that I could get to sort of a succinct list, came up with 10. I think there's way more than 10 key ideas related to this topic, and as we get into it, we'll learn what some of the other items are that we could have featured today, but didn't quite fit the bill as far as trying to fit into the list. So the first topic of importance, I think, is the question, what business are we in as a company? What business should we be in? And part of a quote from Dr. Deming, survival is not compulsory. So here's some advice from Dr. Deming. When he wrote his 1993 book, The New Economics, in the initial draft of the book, this part at the top where it says stage 0, the generation of ideas, was not in it. In the second edition of the book, he did include this view. Now, he started drawing this picture of the organization as a system in the 1950s as he was sharing knowledge and information with businesses and other countries, including the work that he did in Japan with many of his lectures. And so it's helpful to think about looking at the organization as a system this way. And some things to think about here are some questions. So a part of a system to manage an organization has to do with what Deming called consumer research. And some key questions are, what are the customer needs that exist that we can meet? And then that will help us to understand, so what can we do to meet these needs and what differentiates us, which then gets into the generation of ideas to meet that need, which will then get into design and redesign of everything from who you do, so who are your suppliers, the work that you do, the work systems, whether it's products you provide or services you provide in the middle of the system, and then how do you distribute that to the people who are the consumers or the customers. Now, this is a copy of a letter that I got from Dr. Deming. He and I corresponded back and forth many times when he was alive. And this is one you can see. So it's about, well, he passed away in December of 93, so it's more than a year before he died. Anyway, I had written him a letter asking him some questions. I think it was around systems thinking, and he responded, but he didn't necessarily have a long, elaborate answer. He provided some feedback this way and basically put it down into these three phrases. Survival is not compulsory, improvement is not compulsory, but it is necessary for survival, meaning improvement is necessary for survival. So what did he mean by that? And this was his manner to do things and would cause me to think and ponder. And as I learn more, I think what he was thinking about is something like this. So if you have along this axis improvement, progress, or survival over time, and having on this axis time, you can think about what we learn about S-curves as ideas or products that initially perhaps don't have a lot of participation from consumers, or at least people are not interested in, and they gain interest over time. And then after a bit of time, they're no longer able to serve the purpose that they did, and some new idea comes along, some new product comes along and takes that place, and then the cycle continues. Now, we talked about this in another one of our white papers, and the bit.ly link to that is in Evolving Worldview, version 5, that you can get from that bit.ly link over here. Now, we're familiar with this when we think about different products over time, and these are products related to the evolution of sharing and storing sound. So you think about early versions of products that were designed to do this, and initially they worked, but they came across problems that couldn't be solved by working harder to make better products in the manner. So new ideas came along as products evolved from circular wax cylinders to tape to discs to different products, and then we had CDs, and then we had iPods, and then you could put it on your phone, and then you could put it on the cloud. And so different ideas will take over, and it's designed to meet what's the current need that exists in society, and how could we meet the need. And a company that described itself as being in the business of, let's say, making great cassette tapes, like you see in the middle. And they could make great cassette tapes, and they could have all sorts of work being done to make them very efficiently. But they would be out of business because something else came along and could do what was done with cassette tapes even better. So this is an important concept to think about, and that's why we list it as one of our 10 important items. It's important for leaders in an organization to understand that just because they survived in the past and were successful in the past does not mean they'll be successful in the future. And there's always an obligation to think about, what business are we in? What are the needs that exist from our customers, both the customers we have now and the customers in the future? And paying attention to those needs, and then understanding what do we need to do to stay relevant, to be pertinent in the in the environment. Otherwise, survival is not compulsory. There's no law that says any company needs to survive, and those that don't take the time to understand how they're playing a useful role in the call it the web of the society will find themselves out of business. So before I get into the next topic, I'm just going to take some time to pause to see if anyone has any input, observations, questions, or comments on what I just talked about as far as item number 1. Okay, let's go to number 2. Another key topic related to understanding and using strategy deployment, we think has to do with going beyond the prevailing and what we're calling the failing style of management. So what does this mean? This was covered by Dr. Deming when he was describing what was needed in the transformation of management. And it really does mean learning about different mental models for management. Also on the left-hand side, you can see some depiction of the industrial view, top down, a few at the top with ideas, many at the bottom doing the work. Predominant focus on managing the parts, focus on what the individuals are doing, and definitely a mindset that's quite different than the one that's needed for the future, which we show on the right-hand side. Just building on what we have described in that previous thought as far as looking at the organization as a system, but understanding the organization of the system and thinking systemically. Now, going back to the advice from Dr. Deming, when he was talking about his principles of management and the body of knowledge that came from which those 14 principles came from, when he described his system of profound knowledge, he was describing a need for management to step back and really understand that the way that they're managing, the principles, the ideas, the mental models that they had were no longer going to work. He talked about the present system of management is putting us in decline, and what's needed is transformation, fundamental change in the way managers think, not just working harder at the prevailing style, but really thinking about different mental models that are needed. Now, the importance of this related to strategy deployment, I think, comes about, again, from some advice from Dr. Deming and building on some work of Peter Drucker. And it's important, I think, to think about what strategy deployment isn't. So it is not management by objectives as is commonly practiced. Peter Drucker was one of the inspirations for strategy deployment as many people are trying to apply it. But what became known and used as MBO was merely dividing the organization into parts and then managing the parts separately. It had very little to do with what Peter Drucker was talking about initially. And also, strategy deployment is not management by results. And it is not management by imposition of results. So trying to get people and processes to deliver on things beyond their capability. That's not what strategy deployment is intended to be. So when people don't understand these different principles, strategy deployment can merely be another tool that is used to try to get results, like a club. And you can wield this club to try to get people to accomplish results, but that's really not what strategy deployment in its desired use is intended to be. I like the term that Kelly Allen uses, and heard about this when he was making some presentations at the Deming Research Seminar. And he described it's more of management by spreadsheets, scorecards, and other forms of trickery. So if all you're doing is trying to lay the information out using, say, bowling charts like this and get people to get more green as opposed to red, it's not really changing the principles of management. You're just trying to get people to provide the results. And people will try to get the results. Unfortunately, many times they'll get it through distorting the numbers or distorting the system. And the approach that you need to try to get with strategy deployment is a third option, which is to actually improve the system or improve the processes that are delivering the results. So just as I did a few minutes ago, I'm going to pause and see if that viewpoint generates any conversation or questions from anyone.
Mike, I think that these first two parts are really important. I was educated in the old management model. I was accountable at one time for management by objectives in an organization. And when I was first exposed to lean thinking, I had no idea how ingrained my old thinking was and how much it was preventing me from being able to get over to a new mental model of based on systems thinking. So I think that this basis of understanding is just really important and well captured here.
Well, appreciate that, Jeff. I'm glad you're able to join the conversation today. Any other input, questions, comments? Okay, I'm going to move on to another topic that we think is important, and this has to do with shifting a focus from selection to deployment. Now, the basis of this comes from some great work and advice from Pascal Dennis, and you can read his terrific book in Getting the Right Things Done. And Jeff just made a comment, and Jeff is finishing and publishing a book, and I've got some information on that book a little bit later, and would appreciate Jeff weighing in on this. But it is a shift, and so what we've noticed is in traditional, call it strategic planning, a lot of time and effort trying to figure out what is the right strategy. How do we select the right one? And then it seems to be that after much effort to doing that, it is, okay, we've got this thing figured out, and we think this is going to work, and we transition it over to others, and it seems like through communication and some follow-up, but primarily as far as articulating what we want people to do, we need to get these strategies done, as opposed to a different view, which is sufficient time, but certainly not as much time as we did in the past, to determine what are some ideas that we think that they might work, and then figuring out how do we have a process of getting into some rapid experimentation, so much more time figuring out in the real world if the ideas have merit and if they will work. And not just a one-time application of PDSA cycle, but multiple applications of PDSA cycle. And I know, Jeff, you tackle this in some pretty good detail in your book, and building on some work that Pascal Dennis did. So this is, I think, an important concept. And if you have anything more, Jeff, or if anyone else on the call has any other comments to add relative to what have they learned as far as making this shift from a predominant focus of selecting the right strategy to giving more attention and time to the deployment of the strategies. I'm going to pause and see what comments or questions people might have.
I was trained in the old that the strategic planning was an event that would occur every 3 to 5 years. So everybody had to get their ideas on the table or they'd be lost for the next 3 to 5 years. And so when we start treating planning as a management system, an ongoing a system for managing vision and purpose with agility, then we're trying to always collect as much current comprehensive knowledge and figure out what experiments are the ones to be running now and which ones can we defer. And we're not talking about deferring them for 3 to 5 years. The faster we can increase the throughput of our strategic ideas, the more ideas we can handle.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I do think that there is some belief that if we can capture these key strategies, there is some belief that they're going to be good for roughly 3 years or a number of years. And I think, again, we're living in the world where we can say things are changing too quickly and adjusting too quickly. We cannot save them up for every 3 or so years. We have to be able to get into developing strategy way more frequent.
Hey, I think I'm just going to speak up and let you know I'm listening, but I think so far what you've described, aren't even beginning to get where we ought to be. We're still results driven, siloed, go back to the parts and do stuff. And, strategic planning events are events, not systems. So anyway, I'm just letting you know that's where we are, and I'm just listening and thinking about where do you start. That's what I'm listening for. How do you even begin to get people to start thinking a little differently or make the transition?
That's great. I appreciate that. And in some of the later slides, we're going to be getting into a little bit more about, so what do you do? Because this is intended to be a guide, a Pracademic's guide, and it also has some great resources. And in addition to Jeff's book that is going to provide some great guidance on this, other resources that people can get into. But appreciate that that input.
Okay, and one other thing I want to mention. For some reason, I see the first slide and it says it's sharing your screen, Mike, but it's not advancing. So I'm still getting a lot from listening, but I don't know if I'm the only one that has that. And if so, I'll just live with it, but just bringing that to your attention.
This
Well,
is Catherine. I can see the current slide.
Okay.
Okay, so just me, sorry.
All right. Well, apologize for that, but not sure what's happening on that side. When you get the recording, you'll be able to see all the slides. And if you would like a PDF copy of the deck that we're using, you're welcome to have that as well.
Perfect. Thanks.
So it sounds like you're getting something from at least viewing what we're looking at here. Hard to troubleshoot right now. Okay. Okay, another topic. It's not about the tool. So what do we mean by this? As we've been watching and observing, it appears to us that there seems to be at least two schools of thought, at least two, could be more. But there is an approach when people get into strategy deployment, when they talk about, well, we must use the X matrix, and that's how you deploy strategy. There seems to be another school of thought that says, well, companies like Toyota and others didn't use X matrices, but we do see a cascade of A3s that are then cascaded throughout the organization. And so that's the one we follow. And then there's I guess you would call it a mixed school of thought that said, well, we need a bit of both. And the point I want to make here is it's not about the tool. It's what behavior does the tool drive, and does it support the system? Jeff mentioned you needed to have a system, a management system. We talk about a strategy deployment system. Does the tool support it to achieve whatever the purpose is? Again, I'm going to rely on some advice from Dr. Deming here, some advice that he gave in 1980 in a video that was featured on NBC. When he was asked, why is it that your ideas took a hold in countries like Japan, but were not latched onto in so much in the United States? And his comment was, well, people expect miracles. They think they can just copy, but they don't know what to copy. And so that's a hazard. And we're not saying that the tools are wrong, but it is more than about the tool. And it's also important to recall that this tool that you're seeing, whether it was invented and designed from other companies before, was a solution to a problem that occurred in the past. Now, it may be a common problem that you're trying to cope with too, and it may be useful, but it's important to think more about what's going beyond the tool and understanding what is the tool doing. Is it driving the kind of behavior you want? Is it getting the kind of results you want? And then how does it support the system? So we thought that was an important key point to make in this presentation. And again, I'm going to pause and see what thoughts people have with this idea of how do you think about the tools and making sure the tools don't drive you, that you can own and drive the tools. I'll assume that if there's silence, people agree with that concept. Okay, another topic is what we'll call too much on our plates. And so it is not uncommon in organizations as people get into this, then they start to understand what are all the things we're trying to do. And one way to do this is people will try to grasp the current situation, say at a leadership level. Take a post-it note exercise and everyone write down all the different things they're trying to accomplish. What are all of the key strategies, known and unknown, formal and informal, that we're trying to accomplish in the organization. And a common result is many, many post-its on a wall with people understanding. No wonder why we're challenged with making progress, and no wonder why we are working long hours and seem to be not getting headway, is we're trying to do too much. And the question is, how did we get too much on our plate? How did it happen? Another important point is, so if this is what it looks like at the leadership level, what's the impact downstream with the managers, with the front line? What happens then? And then it's important to step back and say, is everything that we're doing of equal and strategic importance? And what topics or activities are operational? Things that need to be done to keep the lights on, but are not differentiating us in a certain way. And then some questions about, so how can we prioritize and filter and perhaps remove from our to-do list, our collective to-do list, the things that are in our activities. We use the term 5S. How can we 5S our plate? And this means figuring out, how do we say no when sometimes we might need to say no. Now, what this looks like in action, here again is not an A3, a X matrix tool. And as we see people using it, say at level 1, at the top level of an organization, what are we working on long term? What are we working on this year? How are we trying to affect those key results? What are we measuring, and then who's responsible? And then you'll see a cascade process that goes from what it means for leaders and what it means for, say, the different divisions or the departments. And in large organizations, you can have several levels of this. And again, it's the use of a tool to try to move things forward, to deploy the strategies. But an important concept here that we want to make with this point is, so the more goals and strategies and metrics that you have, the fuller those plates become downstream. And so when I look at something like this, and I encourage people to experiment with the tools, one of the things that I'm looking for is, how many things are showing up here? And if we look at this under this green category of the what, say this is the long-term objectives. And if you've got something that has a list that's, say, longer than 3, and many times organizations are trying to do a lot, and you'll see a list that goes beyond 3 there. That has a multiplicative effect as it relates to the question of how far, and then how. And then so each item that's added on the bottom has an additional, seems to be a geometric progression that occurs throughout the organization. So it's important to try to hone it down and really think about, when we're talking about these things, how do we keep it to the bare minimum, and then be cognizant of what that impact is. Now, this is a method that we came up with and have used in advising people when people say, so what must we do? How do we sort this out? How do we figure out what is mission critical, what is important, what could go on a wait list, and what needs to go on hold? And it's merely an algorithm that we've used in organizations. So we devised this, and we've shared this with Jeff. I think Jeff's going to include it in his book as a method that, through a series of questions, starting with leadership, to try to discern how do we figure out what needs to be on our plate and how much is too much on our plate, and what do we need to do to try to get it to a manageable level. And in most organizations, I'm going to go back to this model here, when we talk about in the ideal world, these are intended to represent where leaders would be spending most of their time, where managers would be spending most of their time, and where the front line would be spending their time, with leaders primarily in the strategic, managers roughly 50-50. The front line being involved with the strategic, understanding it, but they're really needing to be responsible for how are they managing the daily improvement work and meeting the needs of the current customers. And that line I'm drawing on the left-hand corner is just merely depicting, in most organizations, it's not nearly the 50-50 slant that you see in the ideal state. People are spending more time dealing with the operational problems of the day, the firefightings and those sort of activities, that is keeping them from the things that are pressing. So in addition to sharing that algorithm or an algorithm like that to try to figure out how do we get things off of our plate, and as we try to move to a more ideal state, I like to think of it this way. I think about if this is going to work, we have to do more than just try to move this forward. We have to enable people at the front line to really be involved in not just doing their work, but improving their work on a daily basis. So a daily management system. And if it's really going to work, we have to move from having managers being the problem solvers and the firefighters and helping them to move into a coaching level. So they're translating the strategy to the front line, but they're also coaching the front line to be more active, involved in improving their work. Now, another slide here before I pause again for input. When we explain our model and talk about the prevailing approach for organizations that get into this, it seems to be sorted into what we call the tale of two cities. Most get into a tool-based approach where they learn through tools, and tools are effective. And as people will, I'll use the X matrix again as an example, they'll try to roll this out, borrowing a term that I learned from Mark Graben, lino, like rolling linoleum out, lean in name only. It's going to fizzle out because merely pushing the tools onto systems, into existing work, is not going to get you that long-term result. You may have some initial impact, but it's not going to have the long-lasting impact that you want. And we recommend that people think about an alternative approach, which is think about the principles you're trying to learn and apply, building the systems that you want to see, and then selecting and experimenting with the tools that you would like to use, whether it's an X matrix or whatever. Think about it as selection and experimentation. Now, I saw this term, I've seen this term, and I saw somebody with a t-shirt that said this: don't get wrapped up around the axle. And another way to think about this, and I just made this simple little diagram, is don't get wrapped around the X matrix. Perhaps this slide better fits in the it's not about the tool category, but I thought it was pertinent here as people are trying to figure out how do they select the tools to try to experiment with strategy and move it forward, and how is that going to work. So there's a lot there on the topic of too much on our plates. I'm going to pause again and see what comments or questions people might have on that topic, number 5.
Hi, Mike. It's Ken Stallman from Ameren, and I want to say hi to Lisa as well, because we saw you when we were at BJC.
Oh, yeah.
And a long time, so I need to reconnect with you. There's a lot of things we want to talk about, but I've been following you for a while here. And you know what I wanted to tell you is that, so at Ameren, we're doing a complete deployment through the X matrix, but your point is well taken. I learned my lesson early at some early deployments that if you get the X matrix involved too early, then that's all they want. And then the tool takes over and they can't follow you. So I developed some other things that you do prior, and it has more to do with systems, and it has to do with more about kind of flow down thinking. So your point is absolutely spot on. If I think the tool helps a lot. The X matrix has been very helpful for a body of people who are engineers. So it's kind of systematic, but if you do it too early, it crushes you. So would love to have some discussion about how other people might prepare for the X matrix, but I push it off, and they really want it. They want it early. I mean, as soon as they see it, they're like, oh, let's just fill out the X matrix, and I got to push it off. So
I appreciate your input. It's good to hear your comments on this. It sounds like it's resonating with you.
Absolutely.
And I agree.
And from a practical, I mean, when you're talking about a Pracademic standpoint, I can tell you the wounds, and I can tell you that this is the Band-Aid. That thinking is the Band-Aid.
Yeah, and we know that the tools can be like the crack cocaine for the people that are trying to figure this out. Yeah, it's for lean practitioners. It can be, here's what's the latest tool, and unfortunately, it can become their precious as well. And they'll say, well, it's going to work. Just keep pushing, keep pushing, keep pushing. Appreciate those comments, Ken. Any other input or comments on experience with trying to um, cope with everything that's on your plate and perhaps wean out the things that perhaps are not serving us well to try to make it more manageable with this topic of too much on our plates?
I struggled so much with this early on, and we struggled with it so much as a senior leadership team. So we did the post-it exercise and put everything that we were doing up on a wall. It wasn't until I could see what we were doing as a value stream that I needed that to be able to see what was operations and what was strategy deployment.
Mm-hmm.
Up until that point, everything every day looked like a brand new project. When I could finally start to see my role in a value stream and what we actually did, what operations were, then I could figure out what were the new things we were trying in addition to the operations. But that really took us a long time. After a while, once we did see this work as a value stream, and including strategic planning, we saw strategic planning as a value stream.
Mm-hmm.
Then we could, then the post-it notes became helpful because we were capturing ideas. Then it became just how many ideas can we fit through the value stream. And so we didn't, our board members always encouraged us to get as many ideas out there as we could. So we did want more post-it notes, but we had to have the value stream so that we could process them, or you just get buried in the post-it notes.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Appreciate that, Jeff.
Hi, all. I don't know. Can you hear me now? It's Lisa.
Hey, Lisa.
Hey, Ken. Good to hear from you. I don't know if you all knew I moved out to Penn State Health, and I'm just now trying to initiate the conversations around strategy deployment. So this conversation is great. And I would love to get some information about what you did prior to bringing a tool in.
Absolutely. I'd love to show it to you. Share it. I'll share it with Mike, and that maybe he can incorporate. Whatever. It's fun. I did not know that you moved. You moved. So that's good. That's new news. So send me your email. I'm still at Ameren. So if you send me an email from the Ameren account, that'd be great.
Awesome.
Great. I appreciate that. And we will incorporate these ideas into the next version. The white paper has not been fully drafted yet, and I want to include input from people in the world that are doing this kind of work. So it's got to be more than just thoughts and ideas. It has to be the practical examples.
You know what, Mike? I'll add this. The pictures that you use in here is actually from those pictures are from a company called Lean Methods Group, and that's who we use. I use them to develop our X Matrix, and they're actually fully supportive of the work I do prior to using the X Matrix. They actually incorporated some of that thinking as well. They were like, "Wow, this helps." So anyway, I just find it's just fun, right? It's just fun to what helps people move.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Any other comments on that topic? Okay, I want to talk about instant pudding. And again, another quote, heard this many times from Dr. Deming saying, well, there's no instant pudding, yet people want to have the quick fix and instant pudding. And here's the way we think about this. And it could give some guidance and solace to the people that are maybe dipping their toes in this, and some recommended advice as far as steps. We think in terms of targeted experimentation. So we don't want to demonize the tools. Tools are an important part of the model. But think in terms of experimenting, see what works, see what doesn't, and start with some experimentation. As things evolve, you'll start to see that those tools, and Jeff gave a good example of the tool of looking at post-it notes and ideas fitting on a tool of a value stream, can form a system. Say it's a system of alignment, and it starts to evolve that way, which is terrific. And then as you further develop that, you'll start to see some functional integration. So if we said we have systems of alignment that are blue here, we have systems of enabling, we have systems of improvement in the red, we're starting to see a more fully rounded, more functional system that has evolved over time. And say we do that in one area, call it in a model area, and then have more model areas doing that, you're then going to see the organizational expansion of the mental models and the systems and the tools which is a much more sustainable way to introduce and carry out these ideas. So with this, it's important to think in terms of your role as a gardener and not a mechanic. And again, it goes back to our desire to take the methods and tools and try to push them on to other people, perhaps create a Gantt chart with milestones about how long it's going to take to get this rolled out, just like linoleum. And it just simply does not work. At least it does not work in a sustainable manner. And so this is intended to show that you'll probably have much more longer lasting and impactful results, both in terms of behavior and the measures, if you think more in terms of being a gardener and a mechanic, and encourage the experimentation. So it's one slide, but it's intended to try to provide more guidance as far as a starting point and how do you try to evolve this. So as before, I'm going to pause and see if that resonates with anyone relative to our topic today.
Can you give me an example of being a gardener versus being a mechanic? I'm struggling with that analogy.
Sure. So what does a gardener do? Well, a gardener prepares the soil, similar to what Ken was talking about. What are the things I need to do before I start introducing the tool? Looking for receptivity. When you think in terms of areas for experimentation, who seems to be somebody that's open to new ideas, that's willing to try vastly different things, is not afraid to fail, sees this as a learning opportunity. And so a gardener prepares the soil and then tries to put some seeds of ideas out there and see what takes hold, and then watches and tries to tend to the initial ideas, the initial experimentations, gives encouragement, definitely does some weeding. So there's going to be some barriers that come up. There's going to be some distractions. And so the weeds have to be attended to, and you're trying to nurture and grow the evolution of simple experiments to something that might become more of a full-fledged system, and trying to encourage that to come about. And another thing I think about here is many times people will see and observe examples from, say, a more developed organization. You know, say they'll go to a Toyota or a Honda or a pretty mature healthcare system, if it's healthcare, or another example system. And they'll see something that's been around for a while and they'll say, wow, that's what we need to do. And then they try to lift and copy, and thinking in terms of a mechanic that says it worked there, it should work here. But what they didn't understand was you just can't transplant it. Again, I go back to gardening, you just can't transplant it. It really has to be something that grows within the organization you're trying to grow it within. And so we see frustration and failures, perhaps failure is not the term, but anyway, delays that occur because you can't take something that is more of a sophisticated approach and merely put it into an organization. You have to figure out in that organization you have what will work, what won't work, and you have to find those pockets of receptivity to start figuring out, you know, what are the parts of the garden where it's going probably more likely to grow. So those are some additional comments. Hopefully that is helpful.
Thanks.
You bet. I want to talk about understanding true north. This is one of the topics we wrote a separate white paper on here, and I'm going to go through some concepts here. So we know that in many organizations, most organizations, people are interested in trying to achieve the results, and they'll see them in categories such as this: quality, safety, cost, delivery, engagement, satisfaction. Could be a whole list of kind of things that they're looking at. And people will call these are our key performance indicators. And they're an important part of what needs to be done. And they'll try to make improvements in getting those results. And they'll introduce some tools, perhaps getting them from another organization. And those tools do deliver some results, and they'll say, great, let's have everyone use these tools. And again, they're challenged because the people push back in those systems and they're not always well received, and then it stalls. And what's needed is an understanding that in order for this to really work, you have to go beyond just looking at results, tools, and systems. You have to think about connection to the purpose. Why does the organization exist? What's it trying to accomplish? And then think in terms of fundamentally different principles. Going back to one of our previous points, what are these new principles of management that we need to understand? How do we use those principles to design systems? And then it gets into better understanding who plays the lead roles in order to trying to accomplish results. Leaders are primarily responsible for understanding the principles and modeling the ideal behaviors that come from those principles. And we use the term an 80-20 rule to say that that's their primary responsibility. Doesn't mean they don't have systems, doesn't mean they don't use tools, but if they're not attending to those principles and modeling the ideal behaviors, it isn't going to happen. Managers are primary owners of systems, again, 80-20 rule, and the frontline staff, primary owners of the tools. They need to be the ones that own their tools, and those tools have to be tailored to work for them. It can't be one tool that will work for everyone necessarily. Over time, done right, the variation will be reduced, but pushing one tool across everyone and everyone must use it allows no ownership by the frontline staff to really own those tools. And we talk about this in terms of going beyond the traditional view of True North. So many people will associate True North with this part on the left, which is the KPIs, which is a part of it, but it's incomplete. We think of a fuller view of True North and calling it True North as understanding here's what we want to see, the purpose. Here's what we're trying to do, the ideal behaviors, and the connection between if we do these ideal behaviors, it's a strong driver to what we get. And so seeing True North as a fuller view of all of these things related to this. And again, we have a white paper on this, understanding True North. You can see it, that bit.ly link below. And we think we're in pretty good company related to this. This is something that we derive from TSSC, subsidiary of Toyota Motor Manufacturing Company, going way beyond or beyond merely trying to achieve the results. So from a standpoint of what does this look like in an organization and related to strategy deployment, I've turned it on its axis this way and said, here's what we want to see. These are ideal behaviors. This is what we need to do. And these are the results we want to try to get. So again, the see, do, get relationship shown this way. And we think in terms of strategy and catch ball and what needs to occur. So here are our KPIs listed here, key performance indicators, and think in terms of KBIs, KBIs related to the dimensions of align, enable, and improve. At an organizational level, you're going to see not just those performance indicators, but what are the key behavior indicators we want to see at an organizational level. You'll also see a level of what are the KPIs and the KBIs that are unique and derived for, say, a department level, and then another level at a tactical level. And again, this occurs over time, so this is not something that shows up day one, but you'll see this evolve over time. Again, trying to look at the fuller True North picture. Now, this idea of catch ball, of connecting between the various levels of the organization to explain this and help people to understand this is something that is familiar to some organizations related to KPIs. How are we going to hit these metrics and what needs to happen? But catch ball also needs to occur with the KBIs. How are we going to behave? What are the ideal behaviors that we need to see in order to get these kinds of results, which means we need to affect the systems that are driving those ideal behaviors. And then the catch ball needs to occur not just between leaders and managers, but also between managers and the front line. And that affects the tools that they use. The frequency of how often you're looking at how are we performing relative to KPIs and KBIs is going to be different if you're at the organizational level, if you're at the operational level, say a department, or if you're at a daily, say a daily unit level. And then to add one more dimension to this, when we, again, this is about strategy deployment, we think in terms of there may be a number of strategies that are important at the organizational level. The number of those strategies that are pertinent to a department may not be all directly connected. So for instance, if there's 5 strategies that the organization is trying to achieve, some of them, maybe 2 or 3, would be important to a department. And maybe at a unit level, there's one of those strategies that is important. So we think this is an important way to think about how do you move this forward, and how do you think beyond just getting the numbers, but really looking at true north. So I'm going to pause and see what input that people may have there on that topic. Okay. Now this next topic, breakthrough in big rocks. So I got this idea from Jeff, and I'm glad Jeff's on the call today because he's the one that introduced this to me, made a lot of sense. And he's got another way of looking at true north here where he talks about the work of strategy deployment, the work of operational effectiveness, but then this idea of big rocks. And what I've learned from Jeff and others here is related to there are some efforts in an organization that perhaps they're not strategic differentiators, but they're things that need to be done. In this slide, Jeff mentioned says we need to do an ICD-10 conversion. Another example that I've seen is we need to implement a new electronic health record. And people will say that's going to require heavy lifting by everyone in the organization. It's a necessary thing that we need to do. Doesn't necessarily make us any different from our competitors, but it's something that we definitely need to do. And so that is something that also shows up this way. So again, this is Jeff's thinking here, and I think you probably elaborated on your book, but I want to give you the floor again if you'd like to say more about this concept of breakthrough in big rocks.
Yeah, I've never seen as many big rocks in an organization as I have in healthcare organizations. Most of the manufacturing folks, they just don't have as many. And the thing about them is, people's jobs they're so consumed by coming to work and doing their job every day, trying to improve the process by which they do their job every day. That's operational effectiveness. They've got all these other things coming at them in terms of enterprise-wide initiatives that aren't going to differentiate the organization. And so we all wind up kind of looking like we're doing the same things. And what we got to do is carve out some time on the left to figure out what are we going to do that's going to make us unique and valued in our patients' eyes. And historically, we looked at strategy as asset acquisition, whereas acquiring assets, those are just big rocks. Building buildings, acquiring technology, those are just big rocks. They don't differentiate you. Differentiation comes from process, redesign and creation. And so somewhere with all this stuff that we've got going on and all these assets we are purchasing and everybody doing their job every day, we've got to carve out some time to figure out what is really important that patients are looking for and if we could solve that, that would make us unique. And that is strategy deployment, is the radical process redesign and innovation that's going to create lasting value.
Great. And I'm looking forward to seeing the final version of the book that you've written, and we'll highlight that in a little bit here. But
I was just going to say, as soon as that's out, I want a copy right away, because this is exactly what we're struggling with. The attraction of taking big rocks and shoving that into the Hoshin plan, into Hoshin priorities, business compass priorities as strategy is so attractive. It's unbelievable, and it will not help you win, right? In the utility industry, we talk about how do we move from 4th or 3rd quartile in comparison to peers and move to 1st quartile. Well, you don't get there incrementally. If you do big rocks, you'll incrementally, you just keep incrementally trying to crawl your way up, and so is everyone else. But strategy, the Hoshin is what makes us jump and leap faster, and this is such a salient topic. Mm-hmm. It's just perfect. It's just so timely and so perfect.
Hey, this is. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Lisa.
I was going to ask you. This is Lisa. That when I first saw this slide, because I have seen this before in other places, The thing that was missing that may help in the strategy deployment arrow is the words around breakthrough and the things you don't know how to do. So they do need to be strategically aligned as a differentiator, but then if it's something you already know how to do and just need to execute on it, it may look like a big rock because it's not something that's going to require you to act differently. You just need to actually do it. But in strategy deployment, I have found that it helps, at least our executives, it helped them ask the question of whether it was a breakthrough and something we didn't know how to do yet in order to achieve that differentiated performance or service or whatever it was. And that helped us separate the big rocks from things like implementing Sorian or implementing Epic or there were breakthrough components to it, but some of them were just heavy lifting.
That's good clarification. I really appreciate that, Lisa.
Yep. And I agree with that. The word breakthrough, I cannot tell you how many hours I spend describing to people what it means to be breakthrough. And the most recent example that I've been using is I've been saying, well, if you want a modern breakthrough objective that's been implemented right now is Ford Motor Company announcing they're no longer going to make sedans. Okay. You want to talk about something that is truly breakthrough for their ability to compete in the marketplace? That's one of them. And then they pause and go, whoa, that's pretty significant. Yeah, that's the significance because everyone really loves big rocks, right? They think that that's strategy. So this is gold. This is absolute gold.
And the sad thing about the big rocks is they pull all the capacity out of your organization, and the things you don't know how to do, nobody has time to figure them out because you haven't carved out the time for it. So you have to call it a breakthrough that I don't know how to do yet that differentiates me in strategy, and I don't use all of my capacity for just keeping the lights on.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I was going to say is I use the Kodak example because it's quick, and I just say, well, Kodak camera company was doing a really great job of worrying about big rocks, right? And they're worried about making better film. And then they do have somebody that inside the company that comes to them and says, hey, there's this idea of digitization, right? Pixelization of pictures, and it's pretty cool. And they were so busy working big rocks, they said, don't ever talk about that again. And in 1 year, right, then Sony unloads the first digital camera and they're no longer in business, and Kodak's no longer in business. Yep. So there's really powerful examples to be able to illustrate that exact thing that, that Lisa's talking about. So anyway, this is fun. We're geeks, but this is fun.
You know what that reminds me of too, when you talked about that, is it reminds me of the story of was it the flat screen TV that sat on the shelf for 12 years or whatever it was because they knew how to do it, but they didn't have the system or the marketing or whatever it was to get it out there. So sometimes the breakthrough is maybe not even the technology you've created, but it's the system you need to deliver it in or the readiness of the market. And then that's where your strategy needs to focus, is how do you make that happen? And it's not always just the know-how.
That's great. Well, I'm going to call an audible here because we got basically a minute or so left on this, and I appreciate the interaction that we've had on this conversation. And I didn't get to two of the topics. The number 9, one system that's owned by top management, but it needs to be managed, and then big and little PDSA cycles. But we'll have another webinar down the road. And then there was many topics that I called, they were put on the cutting room floor. So in terms of trying to get it to something that was succinct, many different topics, you can see them lifted here, all important. They're all going to be a part of what eventually will become our white paper, which is not intended to take the place of any other resources that you may glean and use. And so see, these are some other great books that some of which I've mentioned, but other books you can get too. The one that we've been referring to from Jeff is on the right-hand side here. Jeff, any more about the launch date or the book or anything like that?
We're supposed to have them in hand at the end of next week, they say. So
Okay.
I know they're available at Amazon.com and then Catalysis.
Right. And there's Jeff's email address there, so you can bug him there. A book that Jeff references and that I think is really helpful, primarily around how do you develop strategy, is listed over here on the left-hand side, Playing to Win. And so I just highlight that as far as something to put forward there. Some suggestions for further study. There are some webinar links that I've included here. So we've had some conversations on this before. We'll have more, and appreciate the interaction that we've had today. What happens next? If you go to our website, go to webinars, the recording to this is going to be placed in the previous events section. I got a number of topics that are in the works. You can see that they're listed here. One of the areas that I'm doing some work with as far as sharing webinars is Winona Health. They've got a site visit that they host, and they got some great things that they're sharing there. In June, Mark Graben is going to share some topics around a book that he's written called Measures of Success, and so looking forward to that. And then in July, I'm going to be talking about a sense-making framework that some of you may be familiar with, but I've been relearning about it. It's been out for a number of years. The Cynefin framework developed by Dr. Dave Snowden. And so with that, we're at the end of our time. But I do appreciate everyone's time today. Appreciate the interaction. Good to hear from some friends that are moving into other things. Lisa, congratulations on the work in Pennsylvania. And Ken, good to hear from you, and others that are on the call today. Looking forward to continued conversation. So I'm going to close it down. Again, the recording will be available for others, for yourself, and if you'd like to share with others. So I hope everyone has a good day and a good weekend. Thanks again for your time today, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep, thanks, Mike. Just great. Lisa, we'll talk to you.